Hello viewers, my name is Lucky Moguta. I welcome you to our presentation on Chinese investment in Africa, business ethics. We are students at University of Zimbabwe in our second year doing law and currently studying commercial law with our lecturers Ms. Chigogora and Ms. Makosa. I take this opportunity to introduce to you my group members. Brian Maigeta, Sidzai Matsika, Medrin Chiku, Loveness Mutwadziwa, Jameson Chatukuta, Christian Gatz, Emma Chunya, and Vincent Chikerema. This is the team. Now each member is going to unpack to give a comprehensive on a subtopic on our presentation, Chinese investment in Africa, business ethics. And now I hand over to the first presenter who is going to take through on introduction, Sidzai Matsika.
So, over the past decade, China has become Africa's biggest trading partner, actually surpassing the United States in 2009. China and Africa have a long-standing relationship with Africa-China relations having started in the 1980s, and it started on a small scale, and as investment started expanded, scales of China-Africa trade volumes reached 170 billion US dollars in 2017, which is quite a huge increase from just 10 billion in 2000. Chinese investment and cooperations expanded from agriculture, mining, building industry to industrial manufacturing, finance, commercial logistics, and real estate. However, as China's investments grows in Africa, so does debates and controversies over its investment and business ethics. Talking of business ethics encompass multiple aspects of moral standards and practices that guide organizations based on principles like respect for laws, transparency, trust, and corporate responsibility. Business ethics go beyond just a moral code of what is right or wrong, as it attempts to reconcile what corporations must do legally vis-a-vis maintaining a competitive advantage over other businesses. Generally, the law sets the tone for business ethics by providing specific guidelines and frameworks that investors should follow. So, in light of this, Chinese investments and ways of doing business in Africa will be discussed, focusing on issues on foreign direct investments, bilateral investment treaties, human rights, financing, trade policies, amongst other issues. The positive and negative effects of China investment in Africa will be discussed in context of legal issues, business ethics, and human rights issues. So, Madrin Chiku will take us through the background of Chinese investment in Africa.
As a way of background, it is necessary to advise that this conversation of the investment in Africa, business ethics, commenced on the 10th of October, year 2000. This is when China policies became intentional on Africa, pursuant to a meeting that took place in Beijing under a theme called FOCAC, which stands for the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. And this was aimed at actually strengthening the relationships between China and Africa, and they also intended to also challenge the economic globalization and common investment. And also the business activities were a part of investment which were determined by laws and policies of the continent. And it is imperative to also note that China and Africa are a part of the International Center for Settlement for Investment Disputes, which is an international institution under the World Bank, whose primary purpose is to settle disputes in investments. So to take us through BITs and foreign direct investments is Loveness.
One important method through which Africa is developing a strong infrastructure to support this rapid urbanization is through Chinese foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is whereby a company based in one country invests in a project based in another country. The World Data Lab predicts a steady decline in poverty until the year 2030 in Africa. Foreign direct investment will play a key role in providing opportunities for alleviating poverty. Ultimately, foreign direct investments have lots of potential for Africa, but it requires cautious treatment. It's unethical for Africa to become dependent on Chinese investments, neither does it want to go ahead with projects that do not prove to be sustainable or prosperous for African growth in the long term. To date, China has signed 35 African countries, and of the 35 concluded bilateral international treaties, 16 have come into force through ratification. Trade between China and Africa is not balanced as it favors China. There are imports of already processed goods coming in from China, whilst Africa has been losing the majority of its precious raw materials for very little, as evidenced by the sale of lithium mines to the Chinese in Zimbabwe and copper from Zambia. One of the strategies that China is using is the reintroduction of the 21st Century Silk Road Economic Belt Development Initiative, informally known as One Belt, One Road Initiative, which moves across the world creating trade partners. Infrastructural development by the Chinese in Africa has deliberately been engineered to siphon off resources from Africa to China with ease. Brian Mageta will take over and deliver on business ethical issues.
On business ethical issues, there are two theories underpin China's operations in Africa. They believe in utility as opposed to deontology, where they are concerned about the goodness of the end result. The utilitarian principle argues that an action is good, that is ethical if it creates the greatest aggregate happiness in the world. Therefore, the issue of transparency in the business transactions is not accorded much prominence. Article 21, subsection 1 of the African Charter on Human Rights, on Human and People's Rights, advances that all African people have the inalienable right to freely dispose of their wealth and natural resources, as well as exercising their right of sovereignty over natural resources. So, the Chinese investing in Africa have to do so under the mandate that African people benefit from their resources. This means that in its operations, it is ethical that Chinese have to obtain prior and informed consent from the local communities. This is derived from the United Nations General Assembly Resolution of 1962, which states as follows: the exploration, development, and disposition of such resources, as well as the import of the foreign capital required for these purposes, should be in conformity with the rules and conditions which the peoples and nations freely consider to be necessary and desirable with regard to the authorization, restriction, or prohibition of such activities. This principle advances that the ownership of natural resources always rests upon the state, and the state alone has the right to dispose of the natural resources in any way that it deems fit and proper. This also entails acknowledging and respecting the customary laws and practices of the local communities, which therefore fits the stakeholder approach of business ethics. So I'll hand over to Emma Chiunya, who is going to unpack on tax and human rights issues.
On tax issues, it has also been reported that various host governments have allowed the Chinese to operate on a tax-free environment in mining, agriculture, and business sectors, which is causing Africa to lose millions of dollars in form of revenue. It has resulted in the questioning of the integrity of Chinese business ethics. There is lack of enforcement mechanisms with regard to tax-related issues. For instance, in Namibia, President Hage was alleged to be best friends with a prominent Chinese investor, Mr. Jack Huang, and it is alleged that he was engaging in illegal activities such as money laundering, tax evasion, inter alia. The general public held strong conviction that Mr. Huang was untouchable by the law of the land because he supposed the friend of the president and has good ties with the Chinese government. This dilemma could be avoided if there is confidence in rule-based approach of doing business, which clearly separates political affairs from commercial dealings, especially in the context of Africa-China investments and legal cooperation on human rights. Chinese labor practices in Africa has been classified as abusive, exploitative, a health hazard, and irresponsible. The Chinese approach is one of immoral and unethical characteristics, as they are always accused of corruptly obtaining business licenses and gain access to natural resources without necessarily following the bureaucratic processes that are mostly met with resistance from the local communities. This can be seen in the Zimbabwean case of Chituku and others versus Minister of Lands and others, where the applicants were resisting displacement from their ancestral lands in order to pave way for a Chinese investor who wanted to farm lucerne grass on their land. Despite accusations of corruption, immorality, and being unethical, African countries still prefer conducting business with China. However, this is outweighed by the benefit of undertaking investment in the form of FDI, and this has since led to an actual increase in Chinese investment in Africa. The common denominator of it all is that there are ethical concerns about the Chinese business relations models which are imported into the various countries by the Chinese businesses from China, which has poor labor rights regime. I'll hand over to Damson Tukuta. We will take on environmental ecocide.
On ecocide, the term ecocide refers to the devastation and destruction of the environment to the detriment of life. Chinese businesses in Africa are on record for being the biggest perpetrators of environmental damage. Sometimes they wantonly destroy the environment in their resource extraction operations. For example, here in Zimbabwe, we have got Engine Investment Company, which was doing some mining operations in Marange. Several villagers lost their livestock after drinking contaminated water from Save and Oz rivers. Vincent Chikerema on dispute resolution.
In a business environment, disputes are inevitable. When such disputes arise, reference is then made to the Calvo Doctrine. This doctrine asserts that foreigners shall resolve any dispute between them and the host government through local remedies available and shall not invoke diplomatic protection from their state of origin. Invoking diplomatic protection is an exorbitant and fatal privilege, especially favorable to the powerful states and injurious to the weaker nations, as it establishes an unjustifiable inequality between nationals and foreigners. It further impinges on the sovereignty of states. As an investor, country could seek to enforce its own superior laws in the territory of another country. However, it has been noticed that China uses its political and economic might to muscle its way through in resolving disputes with African countries, due to the fact that many African countries owe China so much, to an extent that they are always at the mercy of China and cannot really find recourse in disputes when aggrieved. I'll hand over to my sister who will carry on.
Now moving on to risk factors. Countries in Africa need to remain aware that the rapid investment into the continent will not see a parallel pattern to that of China. In contrast to China, Africa does not have a single unified market. Instead, Africa has many internal barriers to the trade of business, information, and logistics. This reduces the more intercontinental free trade agreements Africa can make, the more the individual countries may reap the rewards of Chinese foreign direct investments. Now moving on to sustainability. Countries in Africa need to remain alert to the potential risks of the tempting FDI pouring in from China. There are risks of African countries falling into unsustainable levels of debt. There have been signs of this danger already. For example, the Ababa-Djibouti Railway cost 1/4 of Ethiopia's budget for 2016, and the Mombasa-Nairobi rail went 4 times above the planned budget for Kenya, with China financing 80%. This would catch up with Africa becoming very vulnerable to Chinese economic shocks very reliant on Chinese finance. Some have come as far as to call this a form of colonization in Africa. The Boget Project spoke to Serena Wang, who translates Chinese news and reports concerning Africa into English for the China and Global South Africa project. This helps to provide an insight into the ideologies and aims and activities of China in Africa. This has actually helped to dismiss westernized myths about Chinese workers in Africa. It highlighted the racism that is present in Chinese activities, but also proved that the debt trapping was not as serious as reported by the West. And it also showed a lot about the operations in China, including coal, cobalt, mining, and the push into the tech industry, explained Wang. This proves useful for helping both the West and Africa understand the aims and activities that China has in Africa. This could be very important for African countries to ensure they undertake projects that are sustainable and properly understood. And to take us through financings, I hand over to Christian Gatsi.
China offers infrastructure development through loans, often advanced at 0 to near 0 interest rates, or they allow for repayment in natural resources. For example, in Angola, the Chinese government offered US$2 billion in aid for infrastructure development projects, thereby securing former shale oil blocks in that country. Chinese investment in Africa is often criticized for lacking transparency. Not much can be found on the agreements that they conduct with the African government. And this has bred a fertile ground of political theories. One such theory being that China is now colonizing Africa. Of note and of interest is the fact that China was able to seize a Sri Lankan port after the Sri Lankan government had failed to repay the loan that had been facilitated by China. And this is often exemplified or magnified as one of the consequences that African countries might face upon default. Critics have also highlighted the fact that the Chinese, when they invest in Africa, they bring their own experts and only employ laborers and no skilled workforce in Africa. This makes it difficult and impossible for African states to obtain some level of skills transfer, thereby shortchanging the African states. I shall revert to Lakmo, who shall provide our concluding remarks.
In conclusion, the presentation hammered on Chinese investment business in Africa, business ethics. In the context of the ethical issues arising from the Chino-Afro relations, it was established that in as much as Chinese investment is easy flowing, with less conditions and barriers, there is a certain unwanted level of ethical practice by the Chinese business, which include corruption, disrespect for labor and employment rights, as well as tax evasion and environmental degradation. This comes to the end of our presentation. I thank you.